Okay, so in the last part of today's lecture, we'll introduce you to the sociology of gender. So some of these terms may already be familiar to you if you've studied Society and Culture Introduction with Steve, SOCA1010, or any other sociology courses in the past. So this is a refresher on some of the, I guess, the key terms and definitions if you need them, but in a nutshell, sociology makes a distinction between the terms of sex or sex assigned at birth, gender, and sexuality, mainly to look at the ways, again, that society and culture and historical forces inform what all of these categories mean and how they're lived in everyday experience. So sex and gender feels like the most kind of personal part of who we are often, but like all social phenomena, it is also, of course, socially and culturally informed and grounded. So it means that it's important to look at what these terms mean in contemporary society in order to understand what they mean for us and how, yeah, they inform our everyday lives.
Mm. So how does sociology challenge these kind of the taken for granted kind of stuff and how does kind of pointing out how gender is socially constructed kind of help us understand what's going on here?
Well, it can help us challenge inequalities that continue to exist in relation to gender and sex. So, um, feminism was particularly interested in the second wave, in particular, after women got the right to vote, for looking at the domestic and labour sphere to look at unequal patterns in household labour and unequal patterns in employment, and the ways that sort of society and culture provides roles for us to inhabit. They seem, like I was saying before, really natural and inherent, particularly still around parenting.
Mm.
Um, but we can see over time that these roles change. These roles don't look the same in every society and culture, and that if we identify that they're unequal, then we should change them. So if there is no inherent basis to, mothering being an essential biological fact that around care and roles, if we instead see that as a very specific requirement of patriarchal capitalist society, which requires the unpaid labour of mothers primarily, historically, and we can see that that benefits certain people,
Mm.
and that those things can be changed, even though they can be really difficult to change.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think it's like one of my favorite kind of understandings of this is like, that about the performativity of gender is like um people that kind of criticize the idea of it are often kind of also the ones policing it the most, right? And enforcing the specific gender roles. So the different kind of cultural and differences across the world in terms of how gender works and the inequalities or the roles that it kind of um, performs is a good example, I think, of how it's just not natural, right? That it's
Mm.
actually a socially social construction.
Exactly. So, for example, boys will be boys is not something you hear as much these days. It certainly was a very, very common phrase I heard throughout my childhood. And it would sort of legitimate a lot of really problematic and toxic behavior that's now considered like outright violent. But it sort of helps to see that gender, particularly in conservative forms, requires that constant reinforcement,
Mm.
because of course, it can be changed, and people, I guess, maybe know that, but there's a lot of vested interests in keeping traditional gender roles the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My favorite kind of make the normal strange example is throughout the 80s and 90s, just how many British UK conservative politicians were kind of busted in inverted commas, like doing kinky sex and stuff. It's like they're always, it seems always the ones that have been the most conservative enforcing those values are often behind closed doors, like living proof of how this kind of stuff, between normal and deviance is very blurry.
Mm. So we've already given a bit of a background as to why this is important, and we'll look at it throughout the course more as well, obviously, in relation to the concepts we've already introduced around the social framings of what is deviant,
Mm.
what is normal, what is legitimated, in relation to those intersecting aspects of young people's lives.
Yeah, and I think the post-feminism thing here is the most kind of important thing in terms of contemporary understandings of what we're going to look at in the course. So can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So post-feminist ideals, I guess, are that feminism and equality have already been achieved. So we don't need feminism anymore. We don't need to pay any more attention to women's rights because women can do everything now. There's nothing holding women back. This is sort of the lean in Sheryl Sandberg kind of girl boss uh, culture that you may be familiar with. It kind of repeats post-feminism, and post-feminist scholarship was sort of around the 2010s, but it kind of comes back around again. There's persisting kind of, I guess, commentary around what should matter or what is a problem in society. And I guess with the rise of women and girls in a lot higher numbers through higher education and in the public sphere now, increasingly through higher rates of employment in compared to, say, the 70s, for example, those kinds of conservative claims are made that, we don't need feminism anymore. It's already been achieved. But this is really useful for upholding the status quo again and to kind of direct attention away from the ways that women and girls, and certainly in relation to intersecting forms of inequality around racialization, location, ability, and
Yeah,
class,
yeah,
how these things are continually overlooked in the sort of the facade that equality has already been achieved.
yeah, and the power again, power and resource allocation really important there. Like a lot of, relatively white privileged women are kind of take up kind of post-feminist kind of standpoints, don't they? And essentially, it's an expression of their own privilege.
Exactly, that this isn't a problem for me, so therefore it shouldn't be a problem for anybody. I sort of it works hand in glove again with capitalism too, like that kind of grit culture.
Mm.
I was able to individually pull myself up by my bootstraps rather than looking at the ways that collective forms of organization around struggles in inequality are required, and that if you're able to somehow operate outside those systems, it's an indication of privilege rather than the absence of structural inequality.
Yeah,
So, yeah, there's been lots of research that's focused on the gendered experiences of young people, particularly post the 1990s in the field.
yep. Australia's been particularly strong in this area. There's lots of really good researchers in Australia doing this stuff. There's a list there. There's your own work. There's Anita Harris's really prominent work over the years about the future girl. That's a kind of foundational canon kind of text in our field. Akane Kanai, who was at Newcastle for a little while, that's a colleague of ours. She's done some amazing work throughout her career about relatability and particularly internet and digital spaces, and more recently about experiences of feminism. And now I think she's like working on motherhood. And many other Australian sociologists and that have worked in Australia over the years: Andrea Wowling, Steve Roberts, Sina Raven, Amy Dobson, Carla Elliott, Bianca Folborn. There's Naomi Smith. There's a bunch of people doing interesting work there. So if you're interested in this field, there's lots of people in Australia doing great work on this.
Yeah, definitely. And in the course, in the gender weeks later on, some of these people will be interviewed. You'll get to hear from them and read their papers in relation to,
Mm.
for example, gender and performance enhancing drugs, as well as other things. So I think gender and youth, like any of these topics, are kind of most clearly relevant when you can look at them as case studies or see how they're operating in their specific practices and phenomena, because then you can really look at, well, what work is gender doing? How is gender being, actively created through the discourses, norms, and practices of young people's lives, and how they sort of struggling to remake these categories sometimes, or coming up against the costs of, transgression a lot of the time, particularly around drug use, around
Yeah,
sexualization, and sex education. We're going to get into all those kind of really interesting topics that work at the intersection of criminality, deviance, gender, as well as the kind of expectations and norms that our current society has for young people.
yeah,
We'll also look at gender and crime in particular, although usually throughout this course we'll be looking at the ways that the sociology of youth, the sociology of crime, and the sociology of gender are sort of entwined and entangled rather than approaching all three together all of the time. But certainly the most prominent studies of masculinity and criminology look at these things more specifically together, and we will cover this in the next few weeks of the course too.
Yeah, it's really important to point out here that like while no, higher rates of men commit crimes, it's not like some kind of natural thing. Like we're very much going to look at here again from sociological understandings of gender and class and race and things like that that kind of point to why these things happen. Notions of masculinity are really important here in terms of often men's sense of entitlement about things, in terms of the way they'll pursue stuff outside of norms. But particularly things like poverty, for instance, are much more likely to lead um, men and women to commit more crimes and be exposed to more forms of deviance. What's interesting about the gender and crime thing as well is how different crimes are treated differently by the powerful, right? So, for the last decade, there's been, it's about one woman per week is kind of murdered by a kind of male that they know in their day-to-day life, right? Again, there's kind of some, moral panic about this, but it's not particularly a kind of central political issue that maybe it should be. I imagine if it was, say, one white male politician being murdered by someone in their life each week, there'd be something maybe looked into and done about it. So the treatment of crime in relation to kind of various categories, gender being one of them, again, it's really important to highlight how, some things are prioritized over others.
Yeah, and what is invisibilized and what is sort of seen as inevitable, it sometimes feels as though gendered violence is felt to be inevitable, and that's we can't do
Yeah.
anything about it, and then that's why it's not on the front page every week. But from certainly from sociological perspectives, we're always pointing out the ways that these things um, exist for a reason and can be changed. If there's no inherent basis to this, which there isn't, then it's an outrage, it's a travesty, and so I guess that's the really important political point here to make around how we view these topics in relation to
Yeah.
crime, in particular, and inequalities.
Yeah.
So we will get into all of this in more depth as the course goes on. We just wanted to, I guess, flag or introduce you to our centre because this is where you can read up about the work we are all doing in this field around these aligned topics. You can look at our profiles there, and our good colleague Julia Cook is, central in leading the centre with us as well.
Hmm.
We often post seminars. Steve has been leading a really successful international seminar series that runs online on a range of different topics that I'm sure you'll be interested in if you're interested in anything to do with youth studies. So keep an eye out for those alerts. I'll put them in the course as well. And Steve, do you want to
Oh
plug your
yeah, so
course?
if you're interested in looking at this stuff more, there's an online course that runs in second semester, Youth Culture and Risk. It's essentially a youth studies course. So where this course is focusing specifically on gender and crime aspects from a youth studies perspective. This is kind of much more broader. We look at kind of transitions and youth cultures, look at the workforce, look at body image and taste and all kinds of different aspects there. It might change a little bit from what's on the list there, but if you're interested in youth studies, it's a course definitely to check out.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. We'll see you next week.